What's going on, guys, and welcome back to another episode of the Book Binge on the King Crusoe YouTube channel. This is episode 9 of the Book Binge, and we are covering Return of the King this week. You can still see my big copy here. That's what we're doing. This month we've been covering all of the Lord of the Rings, so if you've missed either my reviews on Fellowship of the Ring or the Two Towers, you can check right up there. So just as I began the reviews for Fellowship of the Ring and the Two Towers, I'm going to begin with my history with Return of the King. And this is going to be much shorter than the other two sections were because I have no history with this one. This is my first time reading Return of the King. So let's just jump right into the video and discuss the book overall. And yes, you can see a bookmark there. I have finished reading the book. The bookmark is just marking where the appendices begin, because I do plan to read those, but they're not part of anything that I'm going to cover in these reviews or anything like that. Anyway, let's jump right into the review. Just as with the other two videos, what are some of the best elements of Return of the King? Well, first and foremost, how it continues the story. I mentioned how I wasn't a big fan of the timeline split between books 3 and 4 in the Two Towers, and I felt that it was a little bit disjointed, but I definitely like the way that Return of the King wraps up these timelines and works them into being something honestly better. If you're a fan of battle scenes and fantasy, well, Book 5 of Return of the King is going to have you very satisfied because it's basically just one big long battle. Most of Book 5 is just a big long battle, and it's incredible, honestly. The end of Book 5 is perfect. I've got to say that Chapter 8 of Book 5 is a 10 out of 10 wrap-up and could be the perfect ending to Return of the King and the Lord of the Rings as a whole, until you realize how much left there is to cover, including some very important events that obviously happen in Book 6. But Chapter 8 is just so well done that it very, very much wrapped me back into this narrative in a very great way. Chapters 9 through 10 afterwards do a very good job to build up what's going to happen in Book 6. Just all of Book 5 is super good this way. Similar to how Book 3 in the Two Towers had great viewpoints, Book 5 also has very good viewpoints, and it's arguably even better. It alternates between certain characters between chapters, and it makes us care even more about these characters than Book 3 did. Just the viewpoints and the characterization, everything gets much better. In Fellowship of the Ring, the characters aren't the deepest, but as the whole story goes, you start to learn more about these characters and make you appreciate them more, and it's fantastic. And once you consider the fact that Book 5 in Return of the King has some surprisingly high stakes in it in a couple different spots, you really start to realize that some of these characters are in fact in very deep danger, and it's terrifying, but it makes you want to read more. It works very well for me, I've got to say. Then after Book 5 ends, Book 6 recombines the tale a few chapters in to feel a lot more like Fellowship does in terms of pacing. And which is definitely for the better. Like I said, I wasn't a big fan of the timeline difference. And that kind of was still a thing here, but a few chapters into Book 6, like I said, the story recombines and all the characters are together. It's not two timelines anymore, even though the first few chapters of Book 6 are their own thing, the same way that Book 5 was its own thing. But the first few chapters of Book 6, I gotta say, this is something that I loved so much better than Book 4 of the Two Towers. Now, I'm not going to say that Book 4 of the Two Towers is bad, but it's probably my least favorite of all 6 of them. These first 3, maybe 4 chapters of Book 6 in Return of the King do what Book 4 of the Two Towers was trying to do, but better, in my opinion. The entire ending of Return of the King and Book 6 as a whole, I guess, is just super good. Like, it is absolutely fantastic. I loved it so much. The first few chapters are very tense. They're very important in terms of the entire narrative that's happening. But then you realize that starting with like chapter 5 of Book 6 or something like that, it's the resolution of the entire story. Lord of the Rings was originally meant to be one big volume, and when you take into the scope that huge volume and it being like 1,100 pages or something like that, you realize why several chapters at the end of Book 6 are the whole resolution to the story. It's a little bit confusing and surprising when you're reading Return of the King just on its own, but regardless, it still works super well. Like I said, the resolution is super long. It's like several chapters long, but we get to see the loose ends getting tied up and mini resolutions for so many different things throughout these chapters, just one by one, all these chapters that happen. There's so many things that happen that close off questions that you have in your mind from the previous 2 volumes, and even some that you didn't even realize you had. Like, this happened to me a couple times because I just finished reading this book this morning as I'm recording this. There are several things that are tied up in these resolution chapters in Return of the King that I didn't even realize were loose ends from books 1 and 2 primarily. Much of the end of Book 6 does take the journey of Fellowship of the Ring, but in the backwards order, and I just loved everything about the way that it did it. There are melancholic reveals and epic high points throughout the end of this. The battles are great, better than Helm's Deep, at least, in my opinion, especially the one in Chapter 9, because there's, or not Chapter 9, Chapter 8, because there is a little bit to go on. I mentioned that Chapter 5 of Book 6 is basically where the resolution of The Lord of the Rings as a whole starts to happen. And that's true, but it's not just a complete resolution. Like, for example, the way that high school English class might have told you is that, the pacing of a story should start with, the beginning, like the exposition and stuff. And then you start to have, like, rising tension, and it goes up. And then you should have a climax. And then it should come down, and then there should be a resolution. And if you get more complex, you can have like a mini climax that comes down, and then another climax, and it comes down, and you have a resolution. The way that Return of the King handles this is that Book 5 is basically part of a huge climax. So you kind of climb up through the first 2 books to a certain point. You have Book 5, that's just like this arc of a climax. And then you have the first few chapters of Book 6 that just shoot up to the actual climax of the story, and then come down with the decreasing tension. And then once you get to this point, it starts to flatten out a little bit. But then once you get to the end of Chapter 7, I believe, of Book 6, it starts to climb up again to a little mini climax again at the very end. And then it comes down to a full resolution in Chapter 9. But the way that everything is wrapped up is super good. I'm not going to give any spoilers because that's for Book Binge episode maybe 11, but it might be a couple episodes after that. It depends on how I decide to organize the full Lord of the Rings review video. But everything about this finale is absolutely perfect to me. And now we come to an even shorter section of what are some of the worst elements of Return of the King. Well, there's nothing that I can say is super bad about this. I will admittedly say that I had a really tough time getting into Book 5 at first, because, I said it ends incredibly, and I really loved everything about Chapter 8 through 10 of Book 5, but the first, 3 chapters were very painfully slow for me, but this wasn't a problem with the book itself, I could tell. It was because of when I was reading it. I don't know why for sure. I'm pretty sure it has a lot to do with the fact that I was trying to read it very late at night during a couple very busy weeks of work, so it was very hard for me to concentrate. So the first few chapters of Book 5 were very slow going for me, but I think that was a me problem and not a problem with the book. I definitely am reconsidering rereading Book 5 or the first few chapters of Book 5 at some point, solely for getting a better experience with the beginning of Return of the King. But it's not it's not top priority for me, but whenever I revisit Lord of the Rings, I'm going to try to pay better attention to these for sure. Like I mentioned, the resolution is very long. For some, I had 0 issues with this. I loved Book 6 to death, but I could see some people not being particularly fond of the way that something like this happens. The resolution could technically be starting 100 pages before the end of the book in my copy specifically, or close to 100 pages before the end of the book. Even if there are other set piece moments and stuff throughout this resolution, in terms of payoffs happening in Chapter 8 particularly, where there's a pretty cool battle there at the very end, there are a lot of pages in this resolution, and it's going to take a little while, and I could see why some people wouldn't be a big fan of, like I said, 100 pages of resolution, because that's a lot, especially if they're reading this broken up. If you're reading Lord of the Rings all in one stint, it's probably not going to feel as jarring, to be completely honest. But otherwise, I don't have anything bad to say about Return of the King. I was having a very hard time at the start of Book 5, because of personal reasons, but it wasn't bad. Return of the King is just super good. So let's just get right into some of my overall thoughts and observations. The Return of the King is an incredible conclusion to the epic that has been told in the previous two parts. Like, it's very good. Someday I will reread Lord of the Rings all in one volume. It might be this version that I decide to read so that it's not, super split up the way that my mass markets are or anything like that. Because I do just want to reread the entire story all at once, in not necessarily one sitting, because I can't, read for that long at one time, but in one long order. I do want to read all of the Lord of the Rings as one volume, partially to honor the legacy, but also to grow to appreciate it more. I'm sure there are some things that I missed in these readings of the books that I'm sure to catch going through it a second time at some point in the future. I don't know when that's ever going to happen, but I do plan to reread this at least once more in the future, if not several more times, but we'll see. On this read, I will say that Fellowship was my preference, having read all the way through book 5, but after finishing book 6 and Return of the King, Return of the King is inexplicably my favorite, even despite the slow start. It is just so good. My favorite chapters of book 5 is hands down chapter 8. Like I said, it acts as kind of like a perfect ending to Lord of the Rings until you realize that there's so much more to cover. I just enjoyed reading chapter 8 so much, but chapters 6 and 10 are also very good. In book 6, I've got to say, my favorite chapter is all of them. Like, all 9 chapters are my favorite. But if I have to choose one, I've got to say again, chapter 8 of book 6 is the best. It's probably my favorite chapter in all of the Lord of the Rings, period. I'd have to consider it a little bit more, but it probably is. But everything in book 6 is just 10 out of 10 perfection for me. Like I said, I don't really know how to do scores for this, because all of the Lord of the Rings is just perfect. But man, this Return of the King is just such a good ending. For somebody who hadn't read Return of the King, even having read Fellowship and the Two Towers many years in the past, Return of the King is amazing. I loved it a lot. The overall spoiler-free review of Return of the King at this point is that if you haven't read Fellowship or the Two Towers, read those two specifically so that you can experience this conclusion, because it is just that good. And now we come, I guess, to the end of the video, because I don't really have much more to say. It is super good. So if you enjoyed my thoughts on Return of the King, be sure to give the video a like and subscribe, hit the bell, all that fancy YouTube stuff. If you want a backlog of all my videos as well as my writing all in one place, go to seasonalproductions.com and bookmark that. It would mean a lot to me. Come back next week for my January reading wrap-up and February TBR, and then maybe the week after that, like I said, but maybe a little bit later in March, but most likely in March for sure. Come back for a full series wrap-up and review and ranking with maybe a little bit of spoiler talk, including some of my favorite scenes and characters and moments overall. I still got to figure out how I'm going to organize or put together a video like that, like if I would do like a tier list or something, or just talk about things freeform like I am right now, and maybe just include, like, I don't know what I'm going to do for that video, so it might take a little bit longer than I'm anticipating, but either way, subscribe and stick around for that, because I do kind of want to talk a little bit of spoilery stuff about The Lord of the Rings. I just loved The Lord of the Rings. Like, it was so good. It was a lot better than I was anticipating, even though, everybody says it's perfect. So that's how I'm going to end this video. Thank you all for watching. I guess this is the end, so I'll talk to you all again in the next video.